Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today is day 26 in our 90-day SAT prep series. So today we're going to be spending half an hour on the SAT math section and then doing half an hour with the SAT writing section. So for today with the math section, we're going to be only working in the math with calculator section because we've already completed 6 practice tests worth of math no calculator section, and now we're going to finish up our math with calculator sections for those 6 practice tests. So problems 24 through 30 are what we're going to be doing today out of SAT practice test 1. Keep in mind problems 24 through 30 are going to be pretty much the hardest problems for the SAT math section as a whole, because they come at the end of the multiple choice math with calculator section, and we know that the multiple choice math with calculator section gets more difficult as you progress through it. So these are going to be some of the more difficult problems that you'll see on the SAT math section. They'll test you on some of the more difficult concepts and equations, so just keep that in mind. So that's why we're only going to be doing 6 equations in the next about 20 minutes. It probably won't take the full half an hour because we are only doing 6 equations. It'll probably take less than that, so it might only take 20 minutes, but like I said, these are going to be the harder ones, so I want to give a little bit more time per problem to do them and explain them. That way you get a good idea of how to get to the accurate answer in the most efficient manner. So keep in mind that obviously you'll have to move quicker than what I do when you take the SAT, but I'm only covering 6 problems here because I just want to show you my tips, tricks, advice, and strategies. So in the next couple weeks, probably not this week, not the week after, but the week after that, so in about 2 or 3 weeks, is when we're going to really start getting into pacing for the SAT math section, really showing you how you can move much faster. But for now, we're more focused with understanding how to get to the correct answer. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get started with question 24. So which of the following is an equation of a circle in the xy plane with center 0, 4, and a radius with endpoint 4 over 3 and 5? All right, well, we got to know our circle equation in order to get this correct. So we know our circle equation is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared, where r is our radius. Okay, so that's going to equal our radius squared. Now, we know that in this situation, our center is hk, right? So if our center is 0, 4, then we just plug those in for h and k. So we have 0, 4. So x minus 0 squared is just going to give us x squared. And then we'll have x squared plus y minus 4 squared. Y minus 4 squared. So at that point we can get rid of b and we can get rid of d because they have y plus 4 and we need y minus 4 squared. So the next thing, our only difference between a and c is our radius squared term. So let's go ahead and find that. Well, we see that we have our center and we have our end point of a radius. So if we want to solve for that, then we can use, I'll go ahead and plot this out so you can see it better. All right, I'll do an example circle. So this is going to be 0.04. So I'll go 0, 4. And I'm going to zoom in so you can actually see this much better. Let's zoom in, and then I'll erase this real quick, and I'll rewrite it because I want you to be able to see this. So we're going to have 0.0, okay, that's 0 and 4, okay? So that's what that point right there is. Okay, now it tells us that our end point of our radius is 4/3 and 5, right? So we know 5 will be 1 above that 4, so this will be our 5, right? And we know that that's at 4/3, okay? So we go over and up to form this little triangle here. And we see that the radius then is the hypotenuse of this triangle. So we know that we have that 5 minus 4 means that this side is going to be a 1, right? That side length is going to be a 1. And we know that we go from 0 to 4/3. So this side length is going to be a 4/3. So now in order to solve for this hypotenuse, which is going to be our radius, right? That's our radius. We have to square that 1, so 1 squared, then add 4 over 3 squared, and that's going to give us our radius squared. Now keep in mind, we don't actually have to solve for our radius. We only need our radius squared, because if we look up here, we see that that's what we have in our circle equation, right? R squared right there. So all we got to do is solve for this now. We do 1 squared, which is just a 1, and then we add 4 over 3 squared. So when we're doing 4 over 3 squared, what we're going to do is we're going to square 4. 4 times 4 gives us 16, and then we do that over 3 squared. 3 squared is 9, so we're going to have 16 over 9. So now in order to add them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this 1 to a 9 over 9 to make it easier to add. So now I do that, and I see my answer is going to be 25 over 9. Okay, so that's what r squared will equal. So now I just find which answer has that, and I see that answer choice A has that. So A will be my correct answer for 24. So as far as tips that you can use there, if you're stuck on a circle problem and you need to solve for the radius, one thing I recommend doing is drawing out the circle. That way you can kind of see visually what you're going to need to solve for, right? So you got to take that that 1 there, that difference there, that 4/3. You got to square each of them and add them in order to get r squared. So when in doubt with any question on geometry, triangles, shapes, circles, go ahead and draw it out. That can help you see visually what the correct answer is going to be and how you can get there. Okay, the other thing that was really important here is just memorizing the circle equation. Okay, I highly recommend that you memorize it. I think that it's very, very important too. So definitely make sure that you do that. And then other than that, that's really it. After that was just understanding that you have to solve the hypotenuse of that triangle that forms right there. All right, question 25. All right, the equation above expresses the approximate height in meters of a ball t seconds after it is launched vertically upward from the ground with an initial velocity of 25 meters per second. After approximately how many seconds will the ball hit the ground? All right, so we got to solve for when the ball is going to hit the ground. We know that that's the height h, so when it hits the ground, that height's going to be 0. Okay, so if we're solving for the zeros then of this equation, immediately what I see I can do is I can factor t out. Okay, so I'll factor t out, so I'll have t then times negative 4.9 t plus 25. Okay, and that's got to equal 0. Okay, so t equals 0 is an option, but we know that that isn't an option because this ball is launched vertically, so it's going to have to be in the air for some amount of time. So we know that t equals 0 will not be our correct answer, and then we'll have negative 4.9t plus 25 equals 0. We'll add 4.9t to each side. That way we can get a positive coefficient, right? We add that. That's going to cancel out. So we're going to get 0 there. We add 4.9t to this side, 4.9t. We're going to have 25 equals 4.9t. We divide each side by 4.9. Divide each side by 4.9. 4.9 over 4.9. Okay, and we see that t is going to equal 25 over 4.9, which we know is going to be about 5. So our answer there is going to be D, because that's going to be approximately 5, right? So I'll do my approximately sign for that equal sign. It's going to be approximately 5. So answer there is going to be D for number 25. So as far as what we can take from this that you can put in your notes to make sure that you're really understanding how to solve these more difficult problems, a big thing here is just understanding that if our ball is going to hit the ground, that means our height's going to have to be 0. Okay, so there's going to be times when you're going to have to substitute something in like that, and it won't be stated as a number. Okay, it'll just be stated in a statement, and you'll have to be able to figure out that when it hits the ground, that means its height is at 0. Okay, so understand that if you're missing a number and you need a number to solve something, look back in the text because it's probably given somewhere. It might not be given as a number, but it might be told to you in another form. For example, the ball hitting the ground tells us that the height has to be 0. So always make sure to watch for that. If you get stuck and you feel like you're missing a variable, go back in the text and see if you can find it somewhere. It won't always be stated explicitly, but it could be stated implicitly by saying that that ball hits the ground, which means height has to be 0. And then the next thing was just factoring out that t. So we factored out the t, and then we set this part here equal to that 0. All right, so that takes us through 25. Now we can go ahead and switch over to question 26. All right, so Katerina is a botanist studying the production of pears by 2 types of pear trees. She noticed that the type A trees produce 20% more pears than type B, so that means type A is going to equal 1.2 times whatever type B produces. Based on Katerina's observation, if type A produces 144 pears, how many pears did the type B trees produce? Okay, well, we already know that we had that equation because we already put it down as we read through, which is something I recommend doing as you read through any long word problem that's about 4 lines or more. We always want to make sure that we are writing down any equations that it's telling us as we read. So we read that type A trees produce 20% more than type B. So that means we're going to do 1.2 times whatever the type B produces, and that'll give us that type A since type A produces 20% more. We know type A produced 144, so we set that equal to that 1.2b, and we solve for how many type B trees produced. So we divide each side by 1.2 to isolate B. 144 over 1.2 is going to give us 120, which means that our type B trees are going to produce 120 pairs. So the answer there is going to be B. All right, so as far as things that you could put in your notes here, one thing I said, and I said that already, is just to write down your equation as you go through. And then if you did that, this problem really becomes really easy because you just substitute in that 144 for A, and then you just solve for B. So this one really is not too difficult at all. For it to be 26 on the SAT math with calculator section is a little bit surprising just because of the simplicity of the problem right there. So that one really should be a give me, and you should be excited to see that this late because that one, you could definitely get a much harder problem this late in the math section. So that was definitely a bit easier. All right, 27. A square field measures 10 meters by 10 meters. 10 students mark off a randomly selected region of the field. Each region is a square and has side length of 1 meter. No two regions overlap. The students count the earthworms contained in the soil to a depth of 5 meters beneath the ground's surface in each region. The results are shown in the table below. Which of the following is a reasonable approximation for the number of earthworms to a depth of 5 centimeters beneath the ground's surface in the entire field? All right, well, we need to know how big our entire field is. We know it was 10 meters by 10 meters. 10 meters times 10 meters gives me 100 meters squared, or 100 square meters. The next thing I know is that each student is marking off a square region with side lengths 1 meter. So that means that they're each marking off 1 meter squared. Okay, and then they're counting the number of earthworms and a depth to 5 meters. And we know that we're asked about the entire field being to a depth of 5 meters, so that 5 meters there is going to cancel basically. So now we're going to have the number of earthworms in these regions. Okay, I see that I have in my answer choices differences of factors of 10, so I don't really have to worry about being too accurate in counting my average right here between all of these regions, because that's wasting time. I see it's about 150, and I see all my answer choices are multiples of 150, so that's what I take it as. Okay, so I take it as 150 per each meter squared. So 150 earthworms, I'll put earthworms as E per meter squared. Now we have to multiply that by that 100 meter squares in our whole field. Okay, so we have to multiply that by 100 meters squared, because that's how big our field is. We see our meters squared term is going to cancel, and we'll be left with 15,000. 15,000. So our answer there is going to be C, 15,000. All right, so as far as things to put in your notes there, really the big thing is understanding that if we have dimensions like 10 meters by 10 meters, understanding to multiply them to get our total area of the field. After that, understanding that each region is square. So notice how, as I read through a word problem, I annotate the text, right? I'm underlining and circling and squaring things. So any measurements I get, I want to pay attention to. Any restrictions, such as no two regions overlapping, I want to pay attention to. Anything with shapes, I want to pay attention to, such as each region is square. Anything with depth, that's also a measurement, want to pay attention to that. Anything like that, right? And then as far as another big thing here is understanding that we don't have to calculate the exact average from A through J, right? We can just kind of get a rough estimate. And how do we know we can just get a rough estimate? Well, we know we can just get a rough estimate because all of these have that same beginning, right? They're all factors, or they're all 15 multiplied by some 10, right? Whether that's 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, anything like that, right? So we knew we didn't have to calculate that average. That would have just wasted time. Right, so understanding that we can use our answer choices on the multiple choice section to guide a little bit of our work. All right, so now we've got question 28, I believe. Let's see what just happened. It looks like I zoomed way out a minute. Let me get back to where I was. Got question 28, I believe, is what we are on. Yep, all right, let's get started with question 28 then. So I see I have 4 quadrants. I'm told I'm dealing with a system of inequalities. I've got y must be greater than 2x plus 1. I can go ahead and plot that. This plus 1 means that I'm going to have 1 as my y-intercept. I'm increasing by 2x, so that's a positive slope. So my line would be something like that. And I see it has to be greater than, so y's got to be greater than that, so I can shade in that side. Then I have y must be greater than a half x minus 1, so that minus 1 would be right here. We're also increasing still by less than that slope of 2x, but we're still increasing. I see y has to be greater than that as well. So I can shade in that as well. Now I'm asked, in which quadrant is there no solutions to the system? Okay, well, there's going to be no solutions to the system where both aren't shaded in. Okay, so we know that we would only shade in for, oops. Okay, I'll go ahead and rewrite this. So we know that y's got to be greater. We'll call this one, I'm going to call this equation 1, and I'll call this equation 2 just so I can label their lines so you can see it better. That's a 1, that's a 2. We know y's got to be greater than 1, so its solutions are going to be the shaded regions here. Okay, now for 2, its shaded regions would be everything above here, but since we need it where they both are satisfied, we can't include that, right? We would only shade right here. Okay, so the only region that's going to be shaded is going to be this right here. We see that that goes into quadrant 1 because it goes into this quadrant 1, goes into this quadrant 2, and it goes into this quadrant 3, but we see that it does not go in quadrant 4. So the correct answer for the quadrant that contains no solutions is going to be C, quadrant 4, because they don't both satisfy at any point in quadrant 4. Right, the only one that satisfies quadrant 4 is equation 2, but equation 1 does not, so therefore quadrant 4 does not contain a solution. All right, so we got C for 28 as far as big things there that you could put in your notes or watch out for. Anytime we're dealing with something like this, we got to really pay attention to the fact that if we want a solution to be in quadrant 4 right here, we would have to have this line 1 be something like this, right? If line 1 were like that, then we see that we would have quadrant 4 would work. But since that line never comes in quadrant 4, that does not work. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and switch over to question 29. So we've got a polynomial px. The value of p3 is -2, which the following must be true about px. Okay, so anytime that I see a question that's worded like this with a polynomial and the value of p of a number and then just being given what it is, so in this case it's -2, I'd be looking at two things. So one, if it is 0, right, if p of 3 is 0, well that means that it's an x-intercept, which means it'd be a root. So in that case, I'd be looking for x minus 3 to be a factor, right? Since this is p of 3, I'd be looking at x minus 3 to be a factor, because then we'd have x equals 3, right? So I'd be looking at x minus 3 to be a factor in that case. If it were equal to 0, we know that it is not equal to 0, right? We know that it's equal to -2. So we can't say that it is a factor, right? We can't say anything is a factor based on that. But what we can say is that the remainder when p of x is divided by x minus 3 is -2, right? So this p of 3 means that I'm taking this x minus 3, and I'm dividing p of x by that x minus 3, and then whatever this right here is, that's going to be my remainder, okay? So if that remainder is 0, then we know that it's a factor, right? So if it was to say is 0, then we know that it's a factor. In this case, it doesn't equal 0, so it's not a factor. We can't say it is a factor. But what we can say is that the remainder is going to be -2 when p of x is divided by that x minus 3. So we take whatever's in here, right, in that p of whatever, we flip its sign, right? So now we have x minus 3 because we flip the sign. And we know that when p of x is divided by that, then our answer there is going to, or our remainder is going to be -2. So that is one thing you could put in your notes. So if I was going to put this in my notes, I'd basically put down, I'd try to just give an example, I'd say. So I'd probably put down p of 3 is -2, and then say the remainder when p of x is divided by x minus 3 is -2. And then I'd probably also put an example of, say, if p was 5 is 0, then p minus 5 is a factor of p of x. Okay, so I'd also give that example. That way you know what it is when it's a factor as well. All right, so now with that, let's go ahead and switch over to question 30. So this is our last question. So this one's usually going to be the most difficult on the SAT math with calculator section, in my opinion. It'll usually be 30 or 38. But in my opinion, it'd usually be 30. All right, so which of the following is an equivalent form of the equation of the graph shown on the xy plane, from which the coordinates of vertex A can be identified as constants in the equation? All right, so this is a big thing you need to understand. Anytime that you're told that you need to have something identified as a constant in the equation or as a coefficient in the equation, that means that it has to be that number, it has to be present in that equation, right? So in this case, we need the coordinates of vertex A to be present in the equation. So let's go ahead and find the coordinates of vertex A. We see that that's at 1, right? Go down here, your vertex is going to be your lowest or your highest point. If it opens up, then it's going to be your lowest point, and if it opens down, it'd be your highest point. In this case, it's going to be our lowest point since our graph opens up. So that's going to be at 1, and then at about -16. Okay, so we're looking for the coordinates to be identified as constants. We see that the only one that has them identified as constant is option D. So right there, option D is going to be our correct answer, right? So 30 in this case is actually a really, really easy one. SAT practice tests 1 through 4. I find that they're a little bit more out of order than 5 through 10 are as far as difficulty of questions. I find that practice tests 5 through 10, their difficulty is much more, it does a better job of getting more difficult over time. So questions 1 through 30, it gets progressively more difficult. There aren't many easy questions at the end, in my opinion. Keep in mind that is in my opinion. I'm not someone who is associated with the College Board or anything. That's just my opinion as someone who's taken a lot of practice tests and scored 1590, 800 back-to-back. But yeah, so really we're just looking for the coordinates of vertex A to be identified as constants in the equation. The only one that has those coordinates identified as constants is D. It won't always be like that. Sometimes it'll have, you'd have constants that are identified as this with another option, like example could be A, and it'll have -1 and -16, or 1 and 16 as an answer choice, right? But then at that point, what you'd have to do then to find your answer is find which one actually is equivalent to this equation here, right? So if you did have two options that both have those constants, then you have to actually figure out which one is equivalent. But in this case, since we only have one option that has those constants, we automatically knew the answer was D. So that's something you can put in your notes as well. So that takes us through the math section for today. So at this point, we'll go ahead and switch over to the SAT writing section for today. All right, let's get started with the writing section for today. So today's writing section is going to be from a 2019 released SAT. So it's the state of Maine. They released a 2019 SAT. If you look up Maine 2019 SAT, you'll be able to find it there. So I'll be taking you through questions 1 through 22 of that, so that'll be 2 passages in total. And as I go through, I'll be really trying to give you what I look for on the SAT writing section, tips, tricks, advice, strategies that I use for the writing section and that you can use as well in order to become more efficient on the writing section and get to the correct answer faster. But we're going to worry more about pacing in later weeks, so not this week as much. This week we're more focused on accuracy. So as I go through, I'll really be trying to teach you what I look for and how to get to the right answer. And then later on, I'll be teaching you more about pacing. But for now, we're really more focused on accuracy. That's what I'm going to focus on teaching. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we got questions 1 through 11 are based on the following passage. So out of many, one experience. On June 20, 1965, murmurs of excitement filled the Kingston, Jamaica auditorium, where way more people than were expected gathered for commencement. All right, so you already kind of heard me stutter right there. Well, I stuttered because there were so many unnecessary words, okay? This was really a very, very wordy clause here, right? We have way more people than were expected. That's very, very wordy, and that's inefficient, okay? So we're using inefficient word choice when we say that, so we're going to want to find a change there. So we're asked in 1, which choice best establishes the tone and style of the passage. So we're going to look for something that is basically an academic tone and that's also very, very concise, right? Concise, very efficient in our word choice. So let's look at our options. We know A is out because it's wordy. B, an unusually large crowd. Yes, that's very, very efficient. That's very, very concise. Number 1, B is going to be our correct answer there. C, a whole bunch of unexpected people. Once again, that's wordy. And then also, saying a whole bunch is very, very casual, and we don't want to have a casual tone on an academic passage. So we're not going to do C either. And then D, an enormous crowd of unparalleled nature. Okay, that's really too extravagant. Okay, so anything that's also too extravagant can be incorrect as well. So in this case, saying an enormous crowd of an unparalleled nature, that's really too extravagant, and that's not maintaining an academic tone and style. So D is incorrect as well. Okay, the other thing too, well, I'm not going to get into that right now. But yeah, so if it's too extravagant is why D is incorrect. It's not maintaining an academic tone. It's way too out there, way too excited. All right, now we move on. We've got commencement services at the University of the West Indies. Okay, at this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. The university was established by Royal Charter in 1948. Well, before we know if we should add it, let's go ahead and get some context. So let's read on a little bit. Along with the 400 graduates, many people had come to hear the words of that year's commencement speaker, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so we see that we just touched on before the sentence we're considering adding, how there were a lot of people gathering in an auditorium in Jamaica. Now we're talking about how they're gathering there for Dr. Martin Luther King. So it does not seem like the university being established by a royal charter is important there, so we're not going to want to make that addition. So we can get rid of A and B because they say yes, and we're not going to want to make that addition because it's interrupting our discussion of Dr. King's visit with an irrelevant detail. Okay, so answer is going to be C, no, because it needlessly interrupts the discussion of Dr. King's visit with an irrelevant detail. So one thing I want to touch on here is anytime you're asked whether you should add a sentence or not add the sentence, if you're not going to add the sentence, there's usually a couple reasons why. So one of those reasons is going to be because it's interrupting the discussion of something else. Okay, so that's a common reason why we wouldn't want to add a sentence. If we're in the middle of discussing a topic and the sentence we're asked if we want to add is going to interrupt that topic, then we do not want to add it because we don't want to interrupt that discussion. Okay, another reason that we wouldn't include something would be if it merely is repeating information that's already been said elsewhere in a passage. Okay, so that's another reason we wouldn't include something. Now in this case, we haven't included that elsewhere in the passage, so D is going to be incorrect there. But if you had something that was already said previously and you're just restating it, then you don't want to add it again because then you're just repeating information. So in that case, then D would be correct if this were a different passage and that was the scenario. As far as when you should add things, okay, I want to cover that as well real quick. So when should you make additions? When should you add sentences? Well, anytime you're adding something that supports an argument or supports a claim with evidence, then you should add it. Anytime that you're giving examples of a key term, you should add it. Those are really 2 common examples there. So I'll give you more examples of things you should add if I see them on other questions, but really those are the two that come to my top of my head. So anytime that we can support a claim with evidence or explanation, or anytime that we can define a key term or provide examples of a key term to help illustrate the key term. So those are really the two things that come to the top of my mind there as far as when we should make additions. All right, so now we've got the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Furthermore, okay, so anytime I see I have a word with a comma after it at the beginning of my sentence, I know I'm looking to transition from my previous sentence to my next sentence. So I want to connect them using a word there. Or if I can't make a connection using a word, then I don't want to have a word there at all. But I can't have a word that makes a incorrect connection. All right, so we got the Jamaican audience was familiar with Dr. King's ongoing campaign for civil rights in the United States through newspaper reports and television broadcasts, and the effect of seeing Dr. King ascend to the podium just feet away from where they stood was thrilling. All right, so we see that we were really transitioning from a talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Arriving at the commencement speech into talking about how there's much excitement about that speech, okay? So that's not going to be furthermore because we're not tacking on or we're not going more in depth about what we talked about here, okay? What we said before this was how there were a lot of people along with those graduates who came to see who came to hear Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Make that speech. So we're not really going more in depth in that idea. What we're doing is we're talking about how they were familiar with it, okay? But we're not going more in depth on how many people there were. So since we're not going more in depth on how many people were there, we're not going to use furthermore, because if we're using furthermore, we're really looking to go more in depth or tack something on really to this amount of people at this commencement speech. So for 3, A is going to be incorrect. Let's look at our other options. We have as a result, what came before is not causing the next one. So the sentence that comes after the previous sentence is not a result of that first sentence. And then C, by contrast, we aren't contrasting anything either. So our correct answer for 3 is going to be D. We're going to delete that underlined portion and adjust capitalization as needed. Okay, so if we were to read that, then we would just have the audience was familiar with Dr. King's ongoing campaign for civil rights in the United States, which is not really that much connected to our previous sentence. Our previous sentence was talking about things that were going on in Jamaica, all those people gathering there, and then now we're just talking about how familiar they were. Okay, so there's not really a word we can use to connect it, and we definitely cannot use a word to connect it that was given to us. Okay, so our answer there is going to be D for 3. All right, the days. Okay, right here, immediately after I read the days and I see I have one word underlined mid-sentence, I'm looking at 2 things usually. If it's a verb, I'm looking for subject-verb agreement. In this case, when I read the days preceding, I knew that this was the wrong preceding, right? It should be proceedings, okay? When we say the days proceedings, we're referring to the day's events, right? Proceedings, a synonym of that would be events. So when we say the day's proceedings, right, that's what we should be saying. Precedings would be using the wrong homophone, okay? A homophone is a word that sounds similar but has a different meaning, okay? So the correct answer here should be C, proceedings, because proceedings means events, and we're talking about the day's events. Okay, procedures would be something like an operation or a routine. B would be precedent. So precedent would be something that is set in like a court of law. So you would have judicial precedent. So the ruling on a law before. And then A, what was A? We had preceding. Okay, preceding is coming before. Okay, in this case, we're talking about proceedings, which are events. So anytime that I have one word underlined mid-sentence, it's possible it's going to be a homophone question like this. It's also possible it could be subject-verb agreement if it's a verb. So those are 2 things I look for as well. Also, it could be, if it's a pronoun, it could be looking for matching the pronoun's number. So that's another thing that I look for if I have one word underlined mid-sentence. All right, so we have the day's proceedings not only inspired the audience, but also furthered Dr. King's aim of enhancing solidarity between the 2 countries. Without even consulting notes, Dr. King, okay, I know this is going to be correct right away. So how do I know A is going to be correct for number 5 right away? Well, I know that because when I read without even consulting notes, I know that that's what's called an introductory modifying clause, okay? Because when we say without even consulting notes, we want to know who isn't consulting notes. Well, Dr. King is the person who isn't consulting notes. So this introductory modifying clause, whenever we have one of those, we have to have a comma after it. Okay, so we have to have a comma after that. I see that my only option with a comma after it is A, so I know A has to be correct. All right, at the time, both countries were on the cusp of great change. Jamaica, which would have achieved independence from Great Britain in less than 3 years earlier. Well, if we're achieving independence, less than 3 years earlier, okay, if we already achieved independence 3 years earlier, then we're not going to say which would have achieved independence because they already have it, okay? So we can't say it's going to be future tense. So we see that this is going to be a question on tense, right? So when is this happening? Well, it's not happening in the future. It's already happened. Which achieves, that's going to be present tense, and we already know that this happened 3 years earlier, so we're looking for past tense. C, which will have achieved, once again, which will have would not be that past tense. And then we have option D, which is past tense, having achieved, okay? Jamaica having achieved independence from Great Britain less than 3 years earlier. That's telling us they already achieved it, right, when we say achieved. All right, so our correct answer is going to be D for number 6. So anytime that I see a question where I'm dealing with something like would have or have achieved or have in a verb or will in a verb, that's usually an indication to me that it's going to be a tense question, right? So if you see you have a which and then a verb, or a will, have and then a verb, or have and then a verb, anything like that, you know you're probably dealing with a question on tense. And in that case, you're going to want to look around if you're not sure what tense you're in and try to find clues to that. For example, my clue here was the fact that it said 3 years earlier. Other times your clues would be verbs that have other tenses, right? So if you're trying to find the tense of what a verb should be, you look around in the sentence for other verbs, see what those tenses are, and try to match them. That's another strategy you can use there. All right, so we have Jamaica having achieved independence from Great Britain less than 3 years earlier was in the process of forming a government. Well, what kind of government, right? We want to know more. So in this case, the writer's considering revising it to the following. Government in the United States, meanwhile, was on the path to expanding civil rights for its citizens. So should we make this revision? Okay, here's why we should make this revision. Because if we look back, we have this right here. At the time, both countries were on the cusp of change. Okay, that's in the previous sentence. So we want to support that previous sentence by saying the change that occurs in both countries. We talk about Jamaica's change being them gaining independence and forming a new government. Now we want to talk about the change in the United States. So we are going to want to make that revision to support that claim we made in that previous sentence. So let's look at our options. We got A, yes, because it explains why the audience felt a strong connection. No. B, yes, because it provides support for the claim made in the previous sentence. So that'll be our answer there. All right, now we've got 8. So he emphasized the need for a spirit of love and worldwide brotherhood in facing the challenges of the future. So how did I know I had to immediately switch to in facing? Well, one strategy that I do on the SAT writing section is if I see I'm going to have an idiom question, and I'll go ahead and tell you how I knew this was going to be an idiom question, because I saw I had in the middle of a sentence a preposition underlined. Anytime I see I have a preposition, and an example of a preposition, the common ones are of, from. Those are really the main two. Sometimes I think and is a preposition as well, but of and from are really the main two prepositions that in my opinion, you'll see on the SAT writing section. Those are really the two big ones that you should know. At the very least, you should know those two. So if I saw in the middle of my sentence, I have a preposition and then a word after that, or just a preposition underlined, I know that that's probably going to be an idiom question. So if you don't know what an idiom question is basically asking, what would you naturally say, right? So what would a proper English speaker say? So if we're going to say, talk about facing the challenges of the future, right? Let's take away this from a minute and let's look at facing the challenges of the future, because we know that I'm guessing all of our answer choices are going to have facing, and we see that they do, right? So we're really looking at this preposition before it. What should the preposition be, or what should, how do we make this idiomatic or sound correct? So if we're going to say he emphasized the need for a spirit of love and worldwide brotherhood, that's in facing the challenges of the future, right? These facing the challenges of the future, that's in the future tense, right? They're coming, and we need to be connected or have a spirit together of love and worldwide brotherhood in facing those challenges, right? We want to face them together, so it's going to be in facing those challenges of the future. So correct answer for 8 is going to be C, because that's the idiomatic way to say that. Okay, we wouldn't say for the facing of the challenges of the future or through facing the challenges of the future. We would say in facing the challenges of the future. So for Dr. King, Jamaica's newly minted national motto, out of many, one people, perfectly encapsulated this precept of unity. Okay, now I'm told which choice most effectively combines the sentences, right? And I already know that that's probably going to be my question because I see I have 2 sentences with a period between them, so I'm probably going to have to connect them. So Dr. King spoke about unity that day. He also inspired unity. Okay, I don't want to say unity twice, so I'm going to look for an answer choice where I don't say unity twice, because that's kind of repetitive and I don't want to be repetitive. So let's see if I can find one that does that. So we have A, Dr. King spoke about unity by inspiring it that day. Well, that's not really very strong. Okay, if we're saying Dr. King spoke about unity by inspiring it that day, this it, I don't really like it being there, right? By inspiring it that day, That's really a little bit wordy of a way to say it, okay? So him saying that he spoke about unity by inspiring it that day, it's just not really a great way to do it grammatically. It's not something that's incorrect grammatically, it just doesn't flow well, okay? So A is going to be incorrect. B, those speaking about unity that day, we wouldn't say those speaking about unity that day because that's not, the word though there is what makes that wrong, right? We're not like hesitant about speaking that day, and if we say those speaking that day, we're implying a little bit of hesitation and us maybe not wanting to, and we don't want to do that. C, speaking about unity, however, once again, we don't want to include this however here because we're not contrasting anything, and if we're not contrasting anything, we don't really want to use however. D, Dr. King did not just speak about unity that day, he inspired it. Yes, absolutely. Okay, this is connecting two independent clauses. Dr. King did not just speak about unity that day, he inspired it. Connects two independent clauses with a colon. Our second independent clause is illustrating the idea in the first, so that's a perfect way to connect those two ideas, right? That's perfect. Okay, we know also that we're not repeating unity twice there, so that's another big thing. The other big thing is we're setting up this he inspired it to give it more power. By saying he did not just speak about unity that day, he inspired it, we're making this much more powerful as a statement, and that's what we're really looking for from the author, right? He wants to make this powerful. He's saying not only did he speak about unity, he inspired it, right? Really adding that emphasis with that colon. So that colon can be used to add emphasis. We talked about that before, and in this case, that's what we're really looking to do. All right, so we got years later when asked by reporters what they remembered most, many audience members cited the same moment in the speech. They recalled when Dr. King has said, if it falls to our luck to be street sweepers, sweep the streets like Raphael painted pictures, like Michelangelo carved marble, sweep the streets so that all the hosts of heaven and earth would have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper. For people building a new nation, okay, I know I need to get rid of this comma here and just have people building. How do I know that so quickly? Well, I'll go ahead and show you why. When I say for people building a new nation, I don't want to stop at people, right? Because we want to know who are these people, okay? That's a whole phrase that has to go together, okay? That for people building a new nation, that's one phrase that needs to stay together because this building a new nation is describing who the people are, and since it's coming after it, it has to be uninterrupted, okay? So if we have something that's describing those people, we don't want to interrupt it if it's coming after it. So there's not going to be a comma there. So correct answer for 10 has to be B. We wouldn't put anything between people and building, and we wouldn't put anything after building either, because that building is building what? A new nation, okay? So we want to keep that connected as well. No need to mix any punctuation in there. All right, the experience had a profound effect not only on historians, that's not correct, because we were talking about its effect really on the audience up here, okay? Not on historians, so we can get rid of A. We're asked for the best transition from the discussion in the previous paragraph, but also we want to be accurate according to the passage, and that's not going to be historians or reporters. We're talking about the audience, right? His impact on the audience. So correct answer for 11 has to be C, okay? Not those who spoke with him, because there are people who didn't speak with him in the audience who just heard him, and they also received that impact. So 11 is going to have to be C. Okay, at this point, why would I read any of this? I wouldn't, because I'm not getting any points for it, so I skip that. All right, now we got question 12 through 22. So we got the theater Duke. So I'm going to move a little bit quicker on this section because I really want to slow down on that first section to give you more tips, tricks, advice, strategies, but I'm going to have to pick it up a little bit for this passage, but I'll still make sure to give you those strategies and advice. So the theater Duke, when George II, Duke of a small German principality called Saxe-Meiningen, established a local theater in 1866, he oversaw each aspect of production. Okay, what do I see immediately? When I see I have this this M dash right here. If I have an M dash, I'm looking at two options. Either I'm using it to separate non-essential information, or I'm using it for emphasis. Now, since what came before was when George II, that's telling me I'm not going to be using it for emphasis, because we wouldn't say when George II and then emphasize something, because there's nothing to emphasize yet, because we haven't said what he's done or anything. Okay, so we can't use it after that. So I know I'm going to be using it for non-essential information. And if I'm using it for non-essential information, I'm going to have another M dash somewhere. Okay, so C and D would have no M dash anywhere else, so I can get rid of those. So now I'm between A and B. So let's take a look. We have when George II, Duke of a small German principality called Saxe-Meiningen. Okay, that M dash has to come after it. So how do I know it has to come after Meiningen? So I know B is going to be correct for 12. But how do I know that so quickly? Well, immediately when I read when George II, I'm looking for a verb to come after that, right? When George II did what? Well, when he established a local theater in 1866. So the end of this non-essential phrase is after Meiningen, and that makes sense because if we read it, we would have when George II, skip our non-essential part, established a local theater in 1866. He oversaw every aspect of each production. Okay, we see that that could read and be its own sentence, so that means that we did make that correct, because by taking out that non-essential clause, we still have something that could be a full sentence on its own. So B is going to be our correct answer for 12. All right, which choice effectively sets up the information that follows in the sentence? Well, we got to read what follows first, so I'm not even going to read what's up here. I'm going to read what follows and then determine what should come before it. While many principalities had court theaters, a duke would usually appoint a director to oversee the plays. George not only supervised the plays, but also exercised full artistic control over them. So we see that George is very, very involved, and we know that in normal court theaters, he's usually not so involved. He usually appoints a director. So if we're looking at 13, we'd look at our answer choices, try to find something that's showing a high degree of involvement. We see that that's answer choice A. This high degree of involvement was unusual, right? Normal directors would just appoint someone. George did not. He took an active interest himself. B, George had an interest in the arts from a young age. We don't go on to describe him doing it from a young age. C, at the time, Sykes-Meiningen was not a major cultural center. We're not talking about that. And then D, the Duke maintained one of the best orchestras in Europe, as well as an opera company. We also aren't really talking about that in this sentence. All right, so now we've got to transition from the previous paragraph I see is what 14 is, so I want to read a little bit of this. In contrast, George advised actors, designed elaborate setups, choreographed scenes, contributed to the development of greater stage realism, ultimately helping establish the role of the modern director. So I'm looking for something connecting his great involvement to whatever is to come. So I want to know what's to come after in order to make that transition. So when the theater company visited Berlin to perform Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, captivating the metropolitan audience when the curtain rose at 7 on May 1, 1874, the audience was immediately amazed by the production's elaborate setup. Okay, I know productions, there's only one production, and this apostrophe has to come before the S because it's the production's elaborate setup, so they own it, okay? But it's not plural productions, there's only one, so we don't have that apostrophe after the S, it comes before it, and they own these elaborate sets. These sets don't own anything, and there's no apostrophe that is needed in sets, so I can go ahead and get rid of C. I take a look at my options. B is incorrect because the productions do own those elaborate sets. A is going to be incorrect, and then I see that D is going to be my correct answer for 15. Okay, that's just a question about possession and about number for our productions. All right, so now that we've read that, we can really go back up and answer 14. So what's providing the best transition from the previous paragraph? B, it was at the beginning of May. Absolutely not, because that's not touching on his involvement as a director. C, George had to implement many staging changes. That also does not really touch on his involvement as a director and how that was kind of a shift from what was normally occurring. If I look at D, George's work as a director was on full display when the theater company visited Berlin to perform Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Yes, that works well. Another reason that it works well, other than it being factually correct and connecting his work as a director, right? We talked about his work as a director up here. Now we're touching on that again as we transition. Another reason it works very well is because it says it was on full display when the theater company visited Berlin, which is really a great connection there. So I know D will be my correct answer for 14. As far as A, saying George recruited actors, that's not touching on his involvement as a director, so that would also be incorrect. All right, so we have which George had modeled after Roman originals. Columns and decorative sculptures occupied the foreground of the stage, writers considering revising the underlined portion of the following, while a backdrop painted with images of columns and fig trees provided the optical illusion of death. Should we add this here? Yes, absolutely. Why? Well, because it's illustrating that spectacle that's impressing those audience readers, right? So if you remember back to what I said about 10 or 15 minutes ago, I talked about anything that's really supporting our claims with evidence, we're going to want to include that. So in this case, we're really illustrating our claim that he was really great at his job as a director and that he was very innovative, right? So by supporting that, we're supporting that when we say that he had backdrops painted with images of columns and fig trees to provide optical illusions of depth, right? That's a very innovative technique that a director is using here, so that's supporting our argument. So we're going to want to include that. So correct answer for 16 is going to have to be B. All right, so we can go ahead and get rid of C, D there, right? So I touched on that a little bit before, and we see that came back right here. So we have as audience members marveled at the authentic-looking scenery, actors portraying Roman citizens streamed onto the stage, each bedecked in distinctive clothing, footwear, and headdresses. Okay, how did I know I had to get rid of with and just have headdresses with a period after it? So that's going to be D for 17. So how did I know that so quickly? Well, I knew that because I recognized immediately that this was going to be a parallelism question. So how did I recognize it was going to be a parallelism question? And also, what is a parallelism question? Well, a parallelism question is a question where we have to match tense if it's verbs or just match form in this case, right? When we're just listing items, we just need to match form. So how did I know that? Well, I saw I had a list, right? If I have a list and one of my items in my list or one of my phrases in my list is underlined, I know I want to make it parallel with the other items in my list. So I saw I had distinctive clothing, footwear. I need to have and headdresses. Anything I put in between and headdresses would ruin that parallelism, so I don't want to do that, okay? So I wanted to get rid of with there. All right, a trumpet then signaled the entrance of Caesar. Okay, I know I'm probably looking to combine these sentences because I have a period between them. I see I'm asked to combine them, obviously, right? I kind of could tell that without ever reading the question, because anytime I see two sentences with a period between them, they're both underlined. That's pretty much a tell that I'm going to have to connect them. All right, so trumpet signaled the entrance of Caesar. If I see I have Caesar followed by something like Caesar or his or he, anything that's a pronoun referring to Caesar, I know I'm going to want to get rid of it. Okay, and usually when I do that, what I can do is most of the time, in my opinion, I'll see I have Caesar. I can get rid of whatever it is here. If it's a pronoun such as he or his or Caesar, if they were to rename it, I can put a comma there and then use who or whose in order to tack on this last part. Okay, so in this case, we have a trumpet, then signaled the entrance of Caesar, and then I would say whose glittering toga and armor made him instantly distinguishable. So that would be a really, really great option if we have it. If we don't have it, then I'd probably look and see if something like in this case, glittering toga might be moved, and it might just be who, depending on how it's phrased. So let's take a look at our options. So we have Caesar. I don't have a comma with a who there or a whose, so I'm not going to look at that first. I'm going to look for the first one that has a comma and a who or a whose. I see that's at C. So we have Caesar, who was instantly distinguishable by his glittering toga and armor. Yep, that's going to be my answer. That's the most concise way to do it. Anytime I see I've got something like a subject and then a period and then that same subject after it, whether that's in pronoun form or the subject itself, I'm always going to look to do a comma and then do something like who or whose if it's referring to something that they own, and in order to connect them that way, because that's going to be our most efficient way to do it. So correct answer there is going to be C. So that's a hint that you could put in your notes. That's something that I do when I take the SAT writing section. So the audience members were so delighted they broke into applause before a word was even uttered. I could have believed myself back in ancient Rome, one audience member said afterward. All right, so which choice is providing the best introduction to the paragraph? I'm not even going to read what it has right here, right, the first line, because I'm just going to end up probably changing it anyway, so I just read what's coming up in the paragraph. So for example, he set the stage for the climactic murder of Caesar by arranging the crowd of conspiring Romans in a circle surrounding Caesar, thereby suggesting the inescapability of the ruler's fate. He also carefully orchestrated the chaotic moments following the murder when the crowd spins out of control. George split the crowd into smaller units. Okay, that's going to be a comma and then a signing. So how did I know that so quickly, and how can I help you recognize that faster when you take the SAT writing section? All right, well, here's how I recognized that my answer for 20 was going to be B very quickly. I saw I had George, and then I had a verb, right? George split the crowd into smaller units. Okay, then I saw I had he again. Okay, I can't do a comma and then have a subject and a verb because then I have a comma splice because this here was an independent clause, and what comes after it, when I say he assigned, that tells me I also have an independent clause. I can't connect them with a comma, so right away I know that's wrong. So I know I got to get rid of my subject, right? If I get rid of my subject and I have a comma and then a verb, then that's okay. So that's what I'm going to want to do, especially since I said George here, saying he is redundant. So I want to get rid of that, and then I want to drop the ed here and add an ing to whatever this verb is, okay? So if this was run, or I'm sorry, if this was, let me pick a better example. If this was signed, right, spelled S-I-G-N-I-E-D, if that verb right there was signed, I'd look to drop the ed and do signing, okay? So anything like that, I'm looking to drop the ed, put ing on it, okay? So I look to get rid of my pronoun or my subject here. I keep the comma, add ing to my verb. That's something I always look at in those scenarios. So that's a big, big thing. I talked about that, I think, 2 days ago as well on one of the SAT writing sections, and it shows up again here. So that's one thing I always look for, and that's one thing I recommend you look for as well. So that's when we have a subject, and then we have an independent clause, a comma, another independent clause. We look to drop our subject, add an ing onto our verb. So 20 is going to be B. At this point, we can go back and answer 19. So what's providing the best introduction for the paragraph? Well, in this paragraph, what we're really talking about is George choreographing the play's action with that same sort of intricacy that he uses for directing it, okay? So in this case, we're talking about how he involves the crowd, right? He has them arrange to act like conspiring Romans, right? Forming a circle around Caesar. That's choreography. That's them engaging in the play's action. That's really what we're focusing on in this paragraph. So that our best introduction for that would be C. A, the venue George's company used was quite different from those used in Shakespeare's time. We don't talk about that, so A is wrong. B, some audience members were less enthusiastic. We don't talk about their enthusiasm. B is wrong. D, the play emphasizes Caesar's influence over the Roman people. We're just using Caesar as an example, okay? We're just using it as an example to show that choreography. So D is wrong as well. All right, so now we've got 21. So we've got one feels oneself present at the beginning of a revolution. A theater critic wondered of his climactic scene. Okay, if I see I have one word underlined mid-sentence, I'm either looking for subject-verb agreement, or I'm looking for something with a homophone, or I could just be looking for something with tone. In this case, since I see I have the same endings, I know I'm not looking at tense or at subject-verb agreement. I'm looking at tone, right? If I have 4 different word options, and they're not prepositions or anything like that, they're just adjectives or verbs or something like that, and they all have different root words, then I know I'm looking to maintain my academic tone, right? So a theater critic, I keep saying cricket. A theater critic wondered of this climactic scene. The same can be perhaps said of George's achievement overall. Well, a theater critic isn't wondering about this scene. He's really observing that he feels present at the beginning of the revolution. He's not wondering about that. He's made that observation. Okay, he's not presuming it because he's there and he's made the observation. He's not sensing it. He's observing it because he's there, right? That critic is there. So the correct answer for 21 is going to be D. All right, so now we can go and drop down here. We've got inspiring directors around the continent to design and execute more unified, detailed productions. Okay, keep in mind this is my closing sentence of my passage, so I always want to make sure that I'm summing it up with the big picture. Okay, so in this case, though, we're not really given any prompt here. Okay, so normally with the last sentence in a passage, I'd be looking for some sort of prompt for my question, like the author wants to conclude with something saying this or something tying in this or something like that. In this case, there is none. So in this case, I actually don't even have to worry about that because this question here is really just a question of modifiers, okay? So I'll go ahead and show you how I know that. So we have inspiring directors around the continent to design and execute more unified detailed productions, comma. All right, well, who's doing that? Who is inspiring these directors? Who is inspiring these directors around the world to design and execute more unified detailed productions? Well, that's going to be George, okay? We can't say the theater duke. We can't say George is posthumous title, and we can't say the title George. We have to say George. Remember in week 1 when I talked about how modifiers, when we have a modifying phrase or clause before something, what it's modifying has to be the next thing after the comma. It has to be exactly the next thing. In this case, the only one that has that is D. So D will have to be our answer for 22. Okay, so whatever that modifying phrase is modifying, that next word after that comma has to be what it is modifying. So that's how I know D has to be my answer right away. All right, so as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. There'll be a donation link in the description when it's up and running. Any private SAT tutoring I'm doing will be linked in the description. Any private college admissions consulting I'm doing will be linked in the description. As always, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and have a good day.